Me and John Lebkowsky are going to talk to you with a talk with the provocative but possibly also empty, we'll find out by the end of the talk, title, Making Community Real. And real should be seen as in quotations here, probably. But John's probably...
Everything is in quotations right now.
True. So, the way this is going to work, John's going to speak to you for a minute, and do the beginning of our talk, then he's going to...
Actually, about an hour and a half.
Then he's going to hand it off to me, I'll talk for a couple days, and then when we're both done talking, we're going to kind of have, it's sort of in the spirit of EFF Austin EFs, we're going to have a lot of audience participation, so we're going to want to know what you all think about this stuff. So without further ado, I'm going to hand things off to John to get us started here.
Yeah, I'm going to watch the clock. This is not a corporate takeover, it's a cultural takeover. So, online communities. Next slide. Online communities have a pretty long history, kind of all the way back to the start of the internet. People were finding ways to interact online, from like the creation of email. So that's like way before anybody ever thought to build a Facebook or a Twitter or whatever, or even like create a blog. There were people who were finding ways to interact online. And eventually they were building systems that would facilitate that kind of interaction. One that I always use an example, because I've been there for actually over 25 years. I've been a member of the WELL. So WELL stands for Whole Earth Electronic Link. It was started originally by the people of the Point Foundation. The Point Foundation is the thing that was formed with all the money that came in from the Whole Earth catalog. They got together and said, what are we going to do with this money? Well, we'll start a foundation. What are we going to do with this foundation? One thing they did was to start a bulletin board system, which is like an early way to do online community, a BBS. And they started inviting journalists in and people who communicate for a living. And because they were out the Bay Area, most of them were like kind of at least somewhat devoted to the Grateful Dead, so they invited in the Deadheads. What they did was they brought in multiple communities of affinity to kind of bang around in this bulletin board system. And they built it out so that they had a system of kind of big subject areas, which they called conferences, and then topics within those conferences. So you might have a music topic, conference, and within that, a topic might be Frank Sinatra, or a topic might be, so you start talking about jazz and it kind of takes off, and eventually you start a conference about jazz. But really it's like major containers of forums, conversations, that sort of thing. So that's how the WELL was built. And what was great about that was that this structure and the structure of many other BBSs and the structure of many other of the early online communities supported sustained interaction among a group of people that was sort of a consistent group. It wasn't like all the people sort of had some slice of the set of participants. Everybody was talking to everybody else, right? So if you're on Facebook today, you see the people that you've identified as your friends, and they see you, and you might be able to go into something like a group where you can have a conversation, but it tends to be very drive-by in the way conversations are held. We'll talk more about social media in a minute. The main thing about this is that when you build a community, one thing that really defines the community, in my opinion, but it's an informed opinion, I mean, there's other people who agree with me about this, a consistent set of members building history together. If you don't have that history, you don't really have a community. Now, a lot of us, when we first started thinking about community, it was like where we lived, and you had this consistent set of people who lived around each other, and maybe they hung out some because they lived close to each other, and you called that a community. But in cyberspace, we have evolved this thing where you have communities of affinity, where people are hanging out in spaces where there's other people they kind of like to talk to or want to talk to, or maybe the space is defined by mutual interest. So if you have people who are consistently talking to each other and they're building a history and they might even start taking actions, they might start having parties, they might start having, face-to-face gatherings of some kind, then that can evolve into what you might call community. And, there's a whole semantic thing about how to define community, but this is kind of the way I'm thinking of it, right? So next slide. Now, social media. Social media, we're all familiar with it. We all probably use it. Is there anybody in here who does not use social media? See? Okay. So we're all using it. The thing about social media is originally these sort of interesting ways of people sharing with each other and connecting with each other started to evolve. One was like going back to like in the 90s, there was something called 6 Degrees, I think it was. And then around 2000, there was a thing called Rise that was sort of built as a way that people could form networks together. And the guy who started it was influenced by business networking events, right? And then Friendster, Jonathan Abrams put it together, and originally it was kind of a way to meet girls, I think it was. So these things started coming along, and now today, like Facebook has sort of absorbed all of that kind of activity. And then there was another thing where guys said, wouldn't it be great if people could make just a really quick blog post, and just throw that out there, so like microblogging, and that became Twitter. And these things sort of evolved, and they're sort of social spaces. They're not really about community. And they weren't called social media originally, but who gave it that name? It was marketing people. And the reason that marketing people gave it that name is that as these things grew more popular, they could see that people were shifting their attention from their television set and their magazines and maybe websites in general, and they're starting to go into these spaces where they're talking to each other or they're sharing things with each other. And that's where the eyeballs went. That's where the attention went. So that's media. And if you're a marketing person, this is where you hang your marketing messages and your advertising messages. So it became a marketing thing. And this was kind of, for some of us who came from an online community background, and we're saying, hey, there's really a lot of potential here for people to share and interact and have a great time with each other. Then we saw money come into it. And as I say, money changes everything. And the marketing engines started churning along, and the online environments, as I think everybody will acknowledge, started to become less personable, as less like community and more like, media, right? So again, you have this kind of drive-by posting that happens, and people kind of go by in a hurry, and they are throwing images to each other, throwing comments to each other, maybe starting a post and having a short conversation, but you don't have the kind of thing that you had in real online communities where people could have a sustained conversation with the same people in it that went on for months, maybe even years, right? So you don't really have that sense of community. You have a sense of like your network and your friends that you can connect with, but that sense of community isn't quite there in the same way. Yeah, so as I say here, it's a context that's not friendly to the kind of focused interaction and building of history that we associate with community. Next slide. So, the internet still can be a platform for community, and it's still happening. The well still exists, and a bunch of the same people are there. It's gone through various transitions, and the latest was that some subset of the members of the well community, when Salon put it up for sale, and what they were going to do is they were going to charge a huge amount of money for just the domain name, well.com, and they were going to sell it off for like hundreds of thousands of dollars. And of course, the people in the well community freaked out and raised the money. They were able to come together and put together a subset of the community that put money in and build a board of directors, et cetera, form a small nonprofit, and the Well now still exists as that community. And now the people who are members of the Well, or at least some part of that set of members, are the owners of the system, right? Conversations keep going there. It's pretty much mostly the same set of people that were there 20 years ago are still there, and they're still hanging out. So that works. Email lists still exists, and email lists kind of work sometimes to support sustained interaction and may have kind of a community feel. And actually on Facebook, I don't see it as much myself, but I keep hearing from people that they're getting a real sense of community from Facebook groups that they're in. So you could build a Facebook group and you can use it as a community platform. Next slide. So how do you actually make a community happen? And we're talking mostly about online community, but this could probably be any community. Initially, somebody decides they want to set up something for a community. I went to an event one time back in the 90s called Creating Community. It was like a Forum One thing. And John Coate, who was one of the directors of the Well, was there. And he said, well, I have a problem with the title of this conference because you can't create a community. You can put up a context, you can put up a platform, and the community creates itself. If you can attract people. Like the Well invited the kind of people in that they thought would have good interactions, and it sort of grew from there. And it wasn't like somebody was making it happen, but they'd create a context where it could happen. So there's that. So, whatever your goals are, if you try to start a community, once you start it, you have to go with the flow of the community. You can't just insist that it be, you could be like a sort of guru dictator and say, it must be this, but it probably wouldn't work as a community. Heather's always the exception. Dragon Lady, run. So, you can found a community or you can find a community. Maybe you can just kind of find a set of people who have a reason that they want to be together. And, you set something up, you start listening, you try to figure out what it is people want to have. Whether it works to just have a single platform like the Well. Actually the Well community is not on a single platform anymore. There's a lot of Facebook activity among members of the Well, for instance. They have other places they go. Plus, most communities start to have an offline component, which really helps them to really become communities. People like face-to-face, because face-to-face is important to community. And then there's this question about the structure of the community, and we've done an analysis over time of kind of how online communities tend to work, and maybe other communities too, and it's like this fried egg shape. It's really like concentric circles. In the center of that, you have the community organizers who may also, take a role in running the community, or they may just start the thing, and kind of watch it roll out. And then you have people who are more like organizers. Now, I'm going to use the Well as a model for kind of explaining this structure. On the Well, you have the Point Foundation people who started the Well, and then you had community managers that they had running the Well. So they were kind of right in the middle of this concentric circle. And then next level out, you had people that were originally referred to as fair witness, interestingly, later referred to as hosts. But the idea was these were the people who would take responsibility for a conference and manage that conference as fair witness, as host, to make sure that fights weren't breaking out and to make sure that people were not going off the map and that sort of thing. So that's the second circle, and there's a few more of those than there are like the actual community managers at the higher level. And then the third set are the active participants, the ones who actually talk a lot. You find this in pretty much any community, any online community. you got a lot of people who are posting a lot and are pretty garrulous and have a lot to say. And then you have people who don't really post hardly at all. And we often refer to them as lurkers. So they're kind of like the next level out. And there's usually a lot more of those than there are people who are active in conversation. They're kind of like an audience, really, kind of like they're watching all this other stuff go on. And one of the challenges in online communities, if you really want to sort of solicit participation, it's kind of like, how do you draw lurkers into the conversation? Like, what do you do? Surveys or whatever. So there's this sort of like concentric circle thing. It's kind of similar to the ladder of engagement, as Kevin and I were discussing the other day. And that's a structure that tends to hold. Next slide. I think this is you.
All right.
Kevin's on.
All right. Well, let's see if I can say anything half as interesting as John just did. So, taking over where John left off. So, I'm kind of going to use a bit of my experiences running the EFF Austin community as a bit of sort of a case study. I think that EFF Austin it's an example of a community that before the advent of the internet and social media and modern technology, not to say that it didn't exist when that stuff was still in its infancy, but I certainly think that in its current form is an example of a community model that maybe couldn't have easily existed in the past given the technology of the past. When I really think about trying to form a cohesive community, one of which the egg will hold together, I've found, first of all, and this is sort of a guiding ethos of EFF Austin, I think of ACTLab, and I think really it's one of the defining questions of this century, where we all, at this increasing rate of technological change, we have to keep in mind technology must serve community, not the other way around. And I think this is the thing many of us chafe at the modern internet and the platforms specifically, that we see right now a lot of controversy going on both the far right and the far left around the deplatforming phenomenon. And at its core, what this is an anger about is that the platforms are insisting upon communities that fit broad marketing guidelines. And the anger we're seeing is there is still a hunger for authentic community that serves a group of people and their interests and their ideological kinship. Now, maybe that community is really bound together by some abhorrent things, but that universal need for an authentic community, one where people are at the center and where technology is just there to make that authentic connection happen, that's what people are hungering for. Now, technology, how do we use it in a way that benefits community and not the other way around? I think there's a concept when we talk about media, as far as, we can talk about different kinds of media, and I'll go into that a little more in a minute, but media can be broadly classified in a couple ways. One of them is what's called synchronous versus asynchronous communication. Now, face-to-face communication is very much, it's synchronous. There is a temporality to the discussion, and an A, and then a B, and then a C. It flows in a linear time-zero model. Wait, go back real quick. I wasn't quite done with the last slide. Sorry if I gestured. Anyway, what social media and the internet really allow for, and what it's good at, is what's called asynchronous communication. Communication separated from the time sequence in which the communication took place. You can have people stumble upon conversations in cyberspace that took place a long time ago in the actual flow of time. And those conversations can be picked up given the temporal and spatial availability of the participants. Now, this can actually be incredibly powerful in creating a cohesive community. It is especially valuable for keeping the sort of lurkers, the egg white, held on to the community. For people who care about what a community has to say, but for whatever reasons do not have the time commitments to be a leader or an activist or a speaker in that community, it still allows for them to gain that emotional connection you need to feel a part of a community. They can chime in wherever they are, whenever they have time. But at least at this point in time, and who knows, maybe eventually Matrix-style VR technology may make some of the points I'm making or have observed for the time being obsolete. But at least for the time being, there's no substitute for actual face-to-face interaction with meat space interactions, as you might call them. They are the yoke. One of the key things that I've found really gives the EFF Austin community a point of cohesion and regularity is, that we have at least one meetup a month. And this really does serve as an anchor point where as long as we keep that one meetup a month up, how much we do really varies a great deal with the time and availability of our volunteers. But the community doesn't wither and die no matter how busy the core people get, as long as that anchor point happens, as long as there's that monthly in the real world chance for people to gather and remember why they're drawn to this space, what it is about this community that brings them together and wants them to keep coming back. Okay, now next slide. All right, so that picture right there is a picture from a party EFF Austin threw a few years ago in 2017 that I think we called Cyberpunk 2017. It was sort of very much in line with a lot of what we're discussing in this talk and what's being discussed in this conference, where it was sort of trying to examine what our vision of the internet had been in the early days and where we were now. Like, once upon a time, cyberpunk was science fiction. It most certainly is not now. Although there is still a subtle distinction I like, where when we speak of sort of cyberpunk that is still kind of grounded in the temporal present, a term I've heard used to refer to it is now punk. Probably the quintessential example being a show like Mr. Robot or something. But it's, the key distinction being that it's not 20 minutes in the future, it is the future that is becoming in the present. But the thing I think we have to remember, regardless of what medium we're talking about, is the basic drivers of human beings and how they want to communicate and what they want to communicate with each other and the messages that they want to give to the world. These are universals that do not change. For those of you who saw Mark Derry speak yesterday, and he talked a bit about the Jungian collective unconscious and stuff like that, this gets into this idea, as well as my probably too clever pun on Hero with a Thousand Faces there, the Joseph Campbell groundbreaking text. But I talked a bit about synchronous versus asynchronous communication. This is an example of what media theorist Marshall McLuhan meant when he said the medium is the message. That's where the mode of communication matters, whether it's person to person or in cyberspace, that the medium influences how we communicate with each other. But where the medium does not matter is that fundamentally what I've observed is if you want to create a community, it's about telling a story, fundamentally at the end of the day. Human beings, we mediate reality through the lens of storytelling. Everything our senses tell us is jumbled chaos, and we give it coherent meaning from a narrative. And what I've found is that far be it from it being some sort of fake artifice, to create a community is to give people a narrative they want to participate in, to give people a role that they can feel good about playing. For instance, I very explicitly lean in on, that, hey, EFF Austin, we're all cyberpunks, and here we are, street finding uses for things, going up against the Zaibatsu megacorps. This is sure artifice, but it's also, I think, essential to why we all want to be here. We want to play those roles, and it is our engagement with those roles that can keep us coming back. And in fact, one thing I have observed running community, as anybody who engages in activism or community discovers at a certain point, you have points where people clash, and there's disagreement about how the community should be run, both from casual observers, but, especially and dangerously to the long-term viability of a community, from sort of either the founders or the core runners, activists at the center and the yoke. When they clash, as anybody who's been involved in running communities knows, that's when frequently communities fracture and fall apart. There's the old joke that the left's its own worst enemy, and I mean, this is the phenomenon I speak of. And because I have to interpret everything through kind of a software cyberpunky lens, in software we often talk about something sort of called role management, and it's related to security in computers, authentication and authorization, determining who people are in a computer system and what they're allowed to do within that system. And this is sort of created with an abstract software concept called role, where it can give an individual an identity and permissions to do certain things within the system. What I think we observe when we find community in danger of fracturing is it's a role misalignment, specifically in the telling of a story. When the character that the individual in the community believes they are playing, the role they think they are inhabiting, when that role is in conflict with how the community sees that person and what their role is, that's where you get flashpoints of disagreement. Not to name names, but to give sort of a slightly personal example, like one instance I saw of community disagreement was with an individual who clearly thought that his role in the community was to fix what he saw as problems or flaws in the community. And some of what he saw as problems or flaws, nobody else thought was in need of fixing. And so this created conflict. And so I'd say definitely if you want to create cohesive community, whatever space it takes in, you need to make sure you are building a team of people who are self-actualized enough to understand what their role actually is and who they actually are. And they are in alignment both with their own needs and the needs of the larger community. Next slide, please. So, there is some interesting things going on in the digital civil liberties community as far as experiments in community. EFF Austin is a member of a network of activist groups called the Electronic Frontier Alliance, or the EFA. This is a group that is run by Electronic Frontier Foundation from San Francisco, headed up by the gentleman in the yellow shirt there, Shahid Buttar, who is a Stanford constitutional law scholar, who is also an activist, a burner, a spoken word poet. He's performed with Immortal Technique, so he's very broad skill set, as you can see. Oh, and for those of you who want to know, he is currently challenging Nancy Pelosi for her House seat, and you should give him money because he's awesome. Anyway, so for a long time, and John can tell you more about this if you're really curious, but in the early days of Electronic Frontier Foundation, the plan originally was for EFF to be a chapters organization, where there would be different local chapters of the group all around the country. And EFF Austin was actually at the core of the founding of EFF due to some incidents that happened back here in Austin in 1989, 1990, specifically around Steve Jackson games and Operation Sun Devil and the theft of AT&T patents on early message boards. It's a delightful story that you should ask me and John about more if you're interested, but it's a bit of a segue from this talk. But due to certain historical incidents, EFF was birthed by a lot of people in the Austin scene. Lawyers like Ed Cavazos and Mike Godwin were essential to the early creation of the EFF, and actually Rich McKinnon, who's in the room here with us tonight, was actually in the room when EFF was created in Silicon Valley. So, if you want to know more about that historic moment, he may be able to tell you more. But, so EFF Austin came into existence because of our historical connection with the events that birthed EFF. And we sort of became the first chapter. And a few other orgs also started making overtures to becoming chapters. Like the second, we're the oldest member of the Electronic Frontier Alliance. The second oldest member is EF Georgia. There was a group in Atlanta who was very essential in the early founding. And actually the gentleman on the right there is one of the original, they're loud, original founders of EF Georgia. So they're still quite active as well. They're almost as old as we are. But what happened was EFF basically decided in, I think it was 91, 92, that they basically weren't going to be a chapters organization. They were going to focus exclusively on federal legislation. So this sort of very fascinating experiment that was beginning to be birthed in a distributed activist community, one not bound by time and space, kind of, EFF had their reasons for choosing the route they did at the time, but they kind of stopped or put into hibernation a very interesting social experiment. Yes, John?
I just want to chime in and mention that one of the reasons they decided to just do federal legislation, they were influenced a lot by, like, Jerry Berman came in. But another one was because the potential chapters were starting to fight. So there was a lot of conflict. And that sort of freaked them out. And they, Berman, who was just coming in as kind of a new director, felt that he saw people who had very strong passions and wills, and he felt that he wouldn't be able to control the message through all of these chapters, that they really needed to have their own identities. Just wanted to throw that in.
Thanks, John. As I said, he's a font of information if you want to know more about this stuff. But anyway, so the idea of chapters kind of went on hold for a long time. But what sort of happened is, over the last several years, there's sort of been a groundswell in the digital civil liberties movement. The initial movement was sort of birthed by people beginning to realize that there weren't laws governing cyberspace. There weren't norms of behavior, and people's rights were being violated. But as the super Wild West character of the early internet began to settle down a bit by the mid-2000s and Web 2.0 started being a thing, a lot of those initial fears, they were still there among activist communities, but they kind of died down a bit. However, this is the flashpoint, as I'm sure many of you are aware, but the 2014 Edward Snowden revelations really reignited this debate. And there was suddenly a groundswell of realizing that there was a serious danger to all of our communities, potentially the death of authentic community, period. Because authentic community needs a sense of privacy to thrive. As I always say, unless you think society as it exists at this exact moment is perfect, you care about privacy. Because privacy is the way that we change things. If it weren't for privacy, we probably never would have had the abolition of slavery. We probably never would have had equal rights for women. We might never have had gay marriage, decriminalization of drugs.
Equal rights for women?
More equal, but long way to go. No, and actually, you'll note, they're under assault. And you'll note, I should emphasize, remember that a lot of rights that women have won with great difficulty, they're actually based in a right to privacy, actually. Roe v. Wade was decided not actually on equal rights for women, because we still don't have an equal rights amendment. It was decided on an earlier Supreme Court case that basically said that people have a right to privacy, even though it's not explicitly explicated in the Constitution. Privacy is very important to a free society and a society that can change over time. And so we need spaces for authentic communities to experiment and get it wrong and get it right. And so what happened was that there was a groundswell across the country of old groups like EFF Austin, who've been around a long time but had just kind of been chugging along, as well as newly formed groups all over the country suddenly having a newfound sense of urgency to do something. And EFF, in their infinite wisdom, realized that there was this immense groundswell of local support, and they didn't yet have the infrastructure to do anything with it. Thus the creation of the EFA and the appointment of Shahed to sort of run it. And it's a very interesting model of community that I think kind of builds a bit on what John was talking about, where, we talk about on the internet that there's sort of two main models of network architecture. The one that's very ubiquitous, we all know today, of client-server architecture, but also, for anybody who has ever engaged in pirating and BitTorrent knows, there's the more peer-to-peer model as well, where there aren't server nodes that are privileged. Every node is sort of equal in the network. And what I think is very interesting looking at the EFA is that we're kind of getting a best of both worlds coming on here, where you have a peer-to-peer activist network decoupled from time and space all around the country, a peer-to-peer network of activists. Because I should make clear, one thing EFF's been very explicit about is they don't want to be they don't want to dictate on high how the EFA must be run. if you're a member of the EFA, you in theory are in agreement about certain broad principles about privacy and freedom and communication and expression. But there aren't any explicit rules about how you must run your organization to be a member of the EFA. And EFF may have a particular opinion on a certain piece of legislation. They do not require members of the EFA to necessarily have their opinion. It's very much that they are there to provide a way for the groups to communicate and offer help and assistance to each other, but they're not dictating the protocols the groups have to use to run each other. So each node in this network is almost its own fried egg, in John's example, basically. There's a node that has a network of people, and then the core people at the center of that particular egg, that yolk, are then part of this massive decentralized network that goes all over the country. There's chapters in Oakland, in Atlanta, in Ann Arbor, in Los Angeles, in New York, in St. Louis, in Chicago, even in Spokane. Like, this is a national movement that is coming birthed here. And what I will say as well, though, and once again, to emphasize my point, technology serves community, not the other way around. We all had for over a year been meeting in internet-based teleconferences to sort of, talk shop and try to see how we could help each other. But just literally like a month ago, actually less than that, the very first face-to-face meeting of the EFA was organized by the EFF. And what I'll just say is, at least for the time being, there's no substitute for meet space for the time being, much like with the continuity of, monthly meetups to hold the EFF Austin community together. I can't tell you how much stronger a sense of community I think the EFA now feels, now that there's a face and a person behind these ghosts in the machine that were speaking out of their computer. And I see that the drive of the members to help each other and make this community real and make it happen is stronger than I've ever seen before. So once again, we have to remember that the technology is tools. But those tools can allow us to have interesting modes of collaboration that were not previously possible. I can't remember if I had one more slide or not. Yes, one more slide. Final slide, please. So I'm going to sign it of close on some thoughts, and this is also where I'm going to, me and John are going to turn over the audience and hopefully start a conversation with you guys with what time we have left. We have 10 minutes? All right, great. So I'll finish up and we'll talk for a minute. So, what makes community real? Well, to tie back into sort of my point about stories, I think it gives us a chance to be the people we want to be. It gives us a chance to help others be the people they want to be. Life does not have a meaning, but a community can create meaning. And technology is the stage on which people perform themselves. It's not the play itself, but you can't have a play without a stage, now can you? And I want to leave you with a question, and maybe where we can have a little bit of a dialogue in our last 10 minutes. What can we do together today to make our community real? We all have found ourselves in this room together, people who, in a lot of traditional senses of community, would not be a community. We're not all from the same town. We're not all the same age. We didn't all go to the same school, the same church. But we all find ourselves in this room today because we find ourselves feeling like part of something bigger than ourselves, a community, a story. And I think we all want to play a role in this story. And I think it's something that would be very interesting to see as time goes forward, what we can all collaboratively create together and the story that we can all tell each other. Thank you all for listening.
There's another slide, if you could bring that up. Thank you. So, when Kevin and I talked about this, really one of the things we wanted to do with this presentation was use it as a platform for an experiment in making community by inviting everybody in this room to join a community, an online community. So we just set up a form where, we ask for your name and email address, and if you go to this form here and leave us that information. We're going to pull those together at some point and see if a community can form. I mean, we think that because you're here, you have some affinity with the other people here. That's a fairly okay assumption, I think. So, in doing that, there's a couple of things we could discuss here in the last couple of minutes we've got. If somebody has an idea for what this community would be for, and also if you have an idea for what platform we could use. So we're kind of opening it up to everybody here. Also, if you have questions. Yeah, Rich.
So, I have a couple responses to what I heard. I think it sort of resonates how I've kind of reversed positions on how I feel towards community over the last almost 30 years. I used to think that somehow online communities were yearning for more. They were yearning for the full bandwidth experience of face-to-face contact, which I think Kevin mentioned more than once. There's nothing that can replace meet-space. But I've reversed on that. And I think how I prefer to think of it now is that the various media modes, platforms, stages where we perform are all really great in and of themselves. In the same way that we can appreciate the written format versus the celluloid format versus the audio format versus the social in-person format. I mean, when I when I watch a movie, I don't somehow think that this is superior to the book and that books are aspiring to be movies and they're somehow falling short of it simply because someone might argue there's a limited bandwidth in the written word compared to the visual, right? And so I really want to push back on that some of the most fulfilling relationships I've had are with people I've never actually met. It was completely confined to a written relationship. Some of the most intense love affairs I had were in the context of written relationships. So there's that. I just kind of want to push back in that meat space prioritization. And then secondarily, there are some things that where we can perform better in one stage versus another. I think that's where EFF was founded. Like you said, I was present, right? So EFF, in its insight, anticipated a time where more of us would be interacting in virtual spaces. And what could we do to protect ourselves from the meat space, right? Because the meat space was largely ignorant of what was going on in the virtual space. So I always thought of EFF as like the virtual world's embassy in meat space. This is a place where virtual people could interact with diplomatically and politically with meat space to protect itself.
Speaking of sort of the meat space, cyberspace, structural as binary, I think that's breaking down more than ever, as certainly you and I have spoken about, like cyborgs, that they challenge that distinction more and more every day. And I will also say that, John alluded to that, finding community and of all places, Facebook groups. And actually, I'll say that, yes, weirdly enough, if you ignore the timeline on Facebook and confine yourself to a group of interest, you can have some really meaningful interactions with people. And exactly as I say that, when I say about centering technology as a tool for community, there is immense power in the removal of spatiality and temporaneity that cyberspace offers. I am able to maintain relationships that would have 50 years ago withered and died if it was not for these technologies. I think just, my key point is that we have to center all of these discussions in how they are enhancing the authentic connection, whatever form it may take. Like, as you said, you've had these authentic connections with people, and you allude to the old, almost like temporary autonomous zone, really viewing like countries in cyberspace. And I think I think there is a yearning for that model, hence why we see such anger at deplatforming from people of all political ideologies, because that is a place to have that authentic connection and sort of collapse that dichotomy. So, yeah, I mean, I mostly agree with you.
Anybody else? Shanta.
There's something, though, happening in electronic space with all bots and getting closer to this Turing test, bots passing the Turing test almost, at least for social networks, that there really has to be, like, there have been some horribly failed attempts to like force people to represent their actual real identities online, things like that. Google shot themselves in the foot over it. Facebook got away with it before anyone realized what was happening. So, like, there's some really crucial issues to deal with there, and the larger the groups get, the more moderation is required. There's I guess scope is what I'm asking for here. Are you looking for real world community, or I guess you're just surveying?
On this?
Yeah.
Well, what this is that we want to start a community. But as I said earlier, we can't really make the community, but we can invite people to tell us that they want to participate, and then we need to find a platform for at least initial conversation and just see what evolves, you know. And incidentally, if you don't want to write this down, I'll put this on the ACTLab 2019 site, this link. But what we would really, really like for everybody in this room to agree to sign up for this and just see what percolates. Sandy?
Excuse me. I think we're coming up on a problem here. Not you guys, but I mean...
We try to be a problem.
We're all coming up on a problem where we've defined community in terms of a certain privileged class. And that has to do with biology. The edges of that are getting a little hard to find at this point, and we're discovering online that there is another class of beings called bots, and that they don't obey our rules of comedy, and that they have other agendas. Some of those agendas are put on them by biological creatures, and others they have on their own. And the more generative adversarial networks develop, the more agendas they will begin to develop on their own. So we've got a problem where we started out with EFF, with the WELL, with early ACTLab, with a lot of the early BBSs, with the idea that everyone online, I'm using the word one here in a particular sense, everyone online was privileged in a way that was background. We didn't see it. We were privileged in that we were biological, we have bodies. And this is now online becoming impossible to figure out. They're chasing something that they can't possibly catch. Facebook is trying to create filters that would allow them to tell a bot from a human. A long time ago, there were a bunch of people, I'm guilty too, writing about the collapse of biological and the technological, and you're going to wind up with biotechnology or technobiology, and it was all going to be one big undifferentiated mass, and everybody was going to be very happy about it. And that just turned out to be a nightmare. And now the thing we're finding out about meat space is that meat space allows the creation of a different privileged class. And that different privileged class is, once again, the biological humans. And we are going to need that. I'm sorry, there's something wrong with my voice. We are going to need that like we've never needed it before, because the bots are starting to overwhelm the humans' online identities.
So what you're both saying is that the bots are passing the Turing test, and we can no longer tell the difference. And I'm like, well, then who cares? Why can't I have a bot as a friend? Are all bots bad? I mean, does it matter?
Because bots have different agendas from you.
And so do
If
we
you're
all.
not careful, they'll kill you.
Your so-called
letting them
friends
go now.
next to you, your actual family members may have different agendas from you. Maybe a bot could be a better friend than your cousin.
This very much gets to the heart of the question I asked Mark last night about transhuman life forms, basically, and we're just caught in viewing them as enemies or are going to kill us. Maybe we should try to send a diplomatic mission to the bots.
Our side. Well, all right. Mark doesn't like the word transhuman. I'm with Mark. I don't like the word transhuman at all.
Well, there's a whiff of tech bro rapture of the nerds privilege to it, so yeah, I agree. It's a problematic term.
Cyborgs.
No.
You know, bots are privileged too. Bots are privileged in that they don't have to put up with having a body.
After you, Alphonse.
Okay. Just to kind of throw in here, it's not just the idea that bots have an agenda. It's that the people who program the bots also have an agenda, and they're biological humans, right?
Yeah.
And so if they're using the bots to expand their agenda, that's a different kind of problem. So there's kind of like is the bot completely this independent thing? Is it, how you judge whether it's a toxic influence or a non-toxic influence? These are things that we're not really talking about yet, but it's more like, is it a bot? Is it not? Is it biological? Is it not? Maybe that is less important, but maybe the more important difference is how much it's actually a positive influence on you, not just in the short term, but in the long term as well.
Well, there's a question here of how you decide what's in your interest. We've got a lot of actors out there who are trying to figure out ways to become mitochondria in a larger non-biological superorganism that we call capital. And that thing is completely out of control.
Right.
And it's either going to run over us and kill us, or we're going to figure out either join it, which means that we have to change what our agendas are, or we get out of the way. And then there are other actors who don't participate in that paradigm at all,
right.
who are acting out their own personal belief structures in order to make themselves
Right, like
side.
who's to say the corporation isn't another entity in the way that we think of a bot?
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And non-profit corporations.
We're running on old definitions throughout this whole thing, and we need a bunch of new ones. We talk a lot about the Turing test. The Turing test is obsolete. You can't use it to tell anything anymore. And the definitions that we're using for the word bot are also obsolete. We need to rethink that too.
The idea that humans are your friends, I think, is preposterous. We have a plot filter, and so everyone here is a bodied human, and these are all your friends. Hell fucking no! These are deceptive, Janus-faced creatures that are controlling bots that are trying to create, stab me in the back. Why should I trust humans more than I trust a bot? I'll take everybody at face value.
And to your point, Rich, we could just argue that we are biological computers programmed by our environment with a survival at all costs imperative, which, yes, will stab you in the back when that survival is threatened.
Can I just want to acknowledge that our intention in creating this community is to create a community of privileged humans. And if anybody here is a bot, it's okay for you to sign up, but you might let us know.
You can program a bot for survival at all costs too. Humans come pre-programmed for survival at all costs. As yet, we don't have bots programmed for the only other major thing that drives humans, and that's where you guys come in. The other thing is the drive to fuck, and the bots do not have that, and that is a critical difference. That we have a lot of trouble addressing these forums because it's not considered comedy. C-O-M-I-T-Y. It's not considered comedy to talk about those things, but we're going to have to address those too, because they're primary drivers of the organism, the superorganism, and the other things that Bruno Latour would call the non-human.
I do really appreciate your point of pointing out the biological privilege in the argument as well. And that's a little bit, I think, of what I'm hinting at when I keep putting real community in quotes, that there is this sort of almost, Baudrillardian idea of privileging a fake real when there is even no real to talk about.
Well, there's a thing that happens in community where members of the community will kind of start to think that they're thinking alike, whereas they might not be thinking alike.
Yes, and I agree with Baudrillard. Absolutely. And I also claim that if we don't draw those lines, we're dead. We have to state which one is the real reality, and we have to decide which one it is and stick to it.
Thank you for listening to us ramble.